Case 1. Catherine Hoggle, September 7, 2014, Montgomery County Circuit Court. There are cases in the American justice system that do not arrive with clean answers, tidy verdicts, or the kind of closure that allows a community to exhale and move forward. There are cases that stretch across years, then decades, suspended in a terrible legal gray space where the truth is known by almost everyone, and yet justice remains just out of reach. Not because the system failed to care, but because the system itself was tested in ways it had never been designed to handle. The case of Catherine Hoggle is one of those cases. It is a story about two children who vanished from the earth on a warm Labor Day weekend in the state of Maryland. It is a story about a mother at the center of their disappearance. And it is a story about what happens when the machinery of justice encounters a mind so fractured by severe mental illness that the courts themselves must pause, for years, then for more than a decade, before the trial can even begin. Sarah Hoggle was 3 years old. Her brother Jacob was 2. By all accounts, they were bright, lively young children, the kind of small people who fill a household with noise and movement and an energy that is irreplaceable once it is gone. Their mother, Catherine Hoggle, had a long and documented history of severe psychiatric illness. She had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, a condition that, at its most acute, can completely sever a person's connection to the reality that everyone else inhabits. Catherine's illness was not a secret to those around her. It was not something that emerged only after these events. It was a known, documented, medically verified part of her life history, a fact that would become central to everything that followed. Labor Day weekend in September of 2014 was the last time Sarah and Jacob Hoggle were seen alive. They were in their mother's care. When the weekend ended and the children did not appear, their father, Troy Turner, raised the alarm. What followed was one of the most agonizing searches in Montgomery County history, a search that went on for days, then weeks, and that ultimately produced nothing. No physical evidence of where the children had gone. No remains. No scene. Nothing that could tell investigators with certainty what had happened in those final hours. Catherine Hoggle was taken into custody. When investigators attempted to question her about the whereabouts of her children, she did not provide a clear or coherent account. Her responses were disorganized, fragmented, and at times entirely detached from the reality of the questions being asked. She was evaluated by mental health professionals, and those evaluations led to a determination that would define the next 11 years of this case. Catherine Hoggle was found mentally incompetent to stand trial. In the American legal system, competency to stand trial is not a question of guilt or innocence. It is a question of whether a defendant, at the time of their court proceedings, has a sufficient understanding of the charges against them and a sufficient ability to assist in their own defense. If a person cannot meet that threshold, if their mental illness is so severe that they cannot meaningfully participate in their own trial, the law requires that proceedings be paused until competency is restored. In theory, this is a protection. It ensures that no person is railroaded through a legal process they cannot comprehend. In practice, in the case of Catherine Hoggle, it meant that the mother of 2 missing children spent more than a decade inside a state psychiatric facility while the case against her remained frozen. The charges filed against Catherine Hoggle were 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for Sarah, one for Jacob. Those charges carried the full weight of Maryland law. But charges without a trial are, in the legal sense, nothing more than allegations on paper. And so the years passed. Troy Turner, the father of the 2 children, continued to live with a wound that the justice system could not close. Advocates for the children's memory continued to press the courts for movement. Maryland judges continued to receive periodic competency evaluations of Catherine Hoggle, and those evaluations continued to find her unfit for trial. The facility where she was held, the Clifton T. Perkins Hospital Center in Jessup, Maryland, is the state's maximum security psychiatric hospital. It is the institution that houses Maryland's most severely mentally ill criminal defendants. Catherine Hoggle spent year after year within those walls. The medical teams there worked to stabilize her condition with medication and treatment. But restoring someone's competency is not a predictable process. Schizophrenia is a chronic condition. It does not follow a schedule. It does not resolve on a timeline that the courts can impose. What made this case uniquely painful, beyond the obvious tragedy of 2 missing children, was the complete absence of their remains. Without the physical evidence of a crime scene, Without the bodies of Sarah and Jacob, prosecutors faced a profoundly difficult evidentiary challenge. They would have to build a first-degree murder case entirely on circumstantial grounds. They would have to convince a jury, beyond a reasonable doubt, that these children were gone because of what their mother did, and they would have to do it without the foundational physical evidence that anchors most murder prosecutions. As the years accumulated, 2015, 2016, 2017, the case remained suspended. The public did not forget. Sarah and Jacob Hoggle were not forgotten. Their names were raised regularly in Maryland news coverage, in advocacy spaces, in conversations about the intersection of severe mental illness and the criminal justice system. Their father continued to speak about them. Their absence continued to be felt. But the legal process remained locked in place, unable to move forward, unable to conclude. Then, on December 10, 2025, more than 11 years after those two small children were last seen alive, a Montgomery County judge made a ruling that changed everything. After reviewing the most recent battery of psychiatric evaluations, the judge determined that Catherine Hoggle had, at last, been restored to a level of mental competency sufficient to stand trial. She was officially ruled competent to face the 2 counts of first-degree murder that had been waiting for her since 2014. The announcement sent a wave through everyone who had followed this case for over a decade. For Troy Turner, it represented the first movement toward the accountability he had been seeking since that Labor Day weekend when his children did not come home. For child advocates and legal observers, it raised profound questions about the limits and strains of a justice system that must balance legal rights with the urgent need to answer for the harm done to the most vulnerable. As of the time of this documentary, the trial of Catherine Hoggle is in its pre-trial phase. The bodies of Sarah and Jacob Hoggle have never been recovered. They have never been laid to rest. Somewhere, 2 children who deserve decades of life, love, and laughter are waiting for the justice system to finally speak their names in a courtroom. Their father has waited 11 years for that moment. The state of Maryland is now preparing to deliver it. Sarah was 3 years old. Jacob was 2. They deserved better. And the people of Maryland, and of this country, owe it to children like them to demand accountability, to demand that the systems meant to protect the most vulnerable are constantly examined, strengthened, and held to the highest possible standard. This case is a reminder that justice is not always swift, but it must always be pursued. If you found this case important, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every subscribe helps us continue to tell the stories of victims who deserve to be remembered. Case 2. Tanya Lucas, July 7, 1992, Baltimore City Circuit Court. Case 2. Tanya Lucas. July 7, 1992. Baltimore City Circuit Court. There are moments in the history of American criminal justice when the full weight of a conviction and the full weight of what a conviction costs a human being collides violently with the emergence of new scientific knowledge. These are the moments when the system is forced to look at itself, to acknowledge that the tools it once trusted were flawed, and to reckon with the consequences of having trusted them. The case of Tanya Lucas is one of those moments. It is a story of unspeakable loss, a catastrophic fire, 6 children who did not survive, and a mother who spent more than 2 decades in prison for a crime that, decades later, the science could no longer support. The morning of July 7, 1992 arrived in East Baltimore the way summer mornings do. Already warm before the sun had fully climbed, the neighborhood beginning to stir, the sounds of the city building slowly toward another day. The Lucases lived in a row house in East Baltimore, the kind of densely packed residential structure that defines so much of the city's housing landscape. Tanya Lucas had 7 children. 7 children who depended on her, who lived under her roof, who called that East Baltimore row house home. In the early morning hours of July 7th, a fire broke out in that home. It was not a small fire. It was not the kind of fire from which a family escapes shaken but intact. It was a catastrophic fire, the kind that moves fast and destroys everything in its path. 6 of Tanya Lucas's 7 children did not survive. They ranged in age from 1.5 years to 12 years old. 6 children. 6 lives that had barely begun. 1 child survived. The loss was staggering. The community around the Lucas family was devastated. And then, almost immediately, investigators began to ask the question that would define the next 3 decades of Tanya Lucas's life. Was this fire an accident, or was it intentional? Fire investigation in the early 1990s operated on a body of scientific assumptions and methodologies that, at the time, were considered reliable and authoritative. Fire investigators used specific burn patterns, char marks, and pour patterns to determine the origin and cause of a fire. They looked for what they called indicators of arson, specific physical signatures that, in the conventional wisdom of the era, could distinguish a deliberately set fire from an accidental one. These methods had been used in courtrooms across the country for decades. They were treated as established science. The investigators who examined the remains of the Lucas row house concluded that the fire showed signs of having been intentionally set. Their analysis pointed to specific burn characteristics that, in their professional judgment, indicated the deliberate application of an accelerant. Their conclusion was that this was not an accident. It was arson. Prosecutors built a case around that conclusion. The theory of motive that emerged was devastating in its simplicity. Tanya Lucas, facing eviction from her home, had set the fire deliberately in order to access emergency housing assistance. She had allegedly sacrificed 6 of her own children, to solve a housing problem. The trial that followed was shaped entirely by the fire investigators' testimony. The scientific analysis of the burn patterns was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. And the jury, presented with what appeared to be authoritative expert testimony on the physical evidence, returned a conviction. Tanya Lucas went to prison. She was sentenced to serve decades behind bars for the deaths of her 6 children. She maintained her innocence. She appealed. The appeals were denied. The years passed, and Tanya Lucas remained incarcerated while the one child who had survived that fire grew up without her mother. Then the science changed. Over the course of the 1990s and into the 2000s, the fire investigation community underwent a seismic internal reckoning. Researchers, scientists, and forensic specialists began to subject the traditional methodologies of arson investigation to rigorous empirical testing, the kind of controlled scientific scrutiny that should have preceded their widespread use in courtrooms. What they found was alarming. Many of the indicators that had long been used to identify arson, specific burn patterns, alligatoring of wood char, the presence of certain pour patterns, turned out to have innocent explanations. They could be produced by accidental fires burning under the right conditions. They were not reliable proof of intentional ignition. The science, upon examination, did not hold up. This realization prompted a wave of post-conviction reviews across the country. Cases that had been built on the old arson science were re-examined. In Texas, in Illinois, in Maryland, defendants who had been convicted on the basis of fire investigation testimony that no longer met scientific standards began to challenge their convictions. Some of those challenges succeeded. Some came too late. For Tanya Lucas, the challenge eventually succeeded, but not before she had served more than 20 years in prison. Her legal team, armed with updated fire science and expert witnesses who could demonstrate the inadequacy of the original investigation's methodology, brought her case back before the courts. The argument was not merely that the investigators had been wrong. The argument was that the methods they used were fundamentally unreliable, that no competent application of current fire science could support the conclusion that the Lucas fire was intentionally set. The courts agreed. Tanya Lucas's conviction was overturned. After years of legal proceedings, retrials, and ongoing litigation, her conviction was completely set aside. She was released from prison having served more than 2 decades for a crime that the science could no longer prove she committed. The case of Tanya Lucas is not a story with a simple resolution. The fire still happened. 6 children still lost their lives on that July morning in East Baltimore. Whether the fire was accidental or intentional, 6 young people are gone, and nothing about Tanya Lucas's release brings them back. What her case represents is something different. A confrontation with the limits of forensic science, a reckoning with the consequences of building criminal convictions on methodologies that have not been adequately validated, and a reminder that the justice system's commitment to truth must be ongoing, not frozen at the moment of an initial verdict. For Tanya Lucas, freedom came after more than 20 years. For 6 children, it never came at all. Their names deserve to be spoken. Their lives deserve to be protected. And the systems that failed them, both the fire that took them and the science that may have misread it, deserve to be examined with full honesty and full accountability. Child safety organizations across Maryland continue to work to ensure that families in crisis have access to housing support, emergency assistance, and child welfare resources before tragedy occurs. If you or someone you know is in a family crisis situation, resources are available through the Maryland Department of Human Services and the National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-4-CHILD. If this case moved you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support keeps this work going. Case 3. Oriel Montgomery, October 4, 2022, Baltimore City Circuit Court. Case 3. Oriel Montgomery. October 4, 2022. Baltimore City Circuit Court. There are cases that arrive without warning, not building over months of documented history, not preceded by a paper trail of prior interventions or escalating alarm, but arriving suddenly, on an ordinary day, when emergency responders receive a call that pulls them to an address in Baltimore City and nothing they find when they arrive is consistent with anything that should have happened to a child who was only 1 year old. Naimia Gilliard was 1 year old. She was at an age when the world is supposed to be a place of discovery, of learning to walk, of learning that objects have names, of beginning to understand the faces around you and the love those faces are supposed to carry. She was at an age when the adults in her life were her entire universe, the people she depended on for everything, the people her survival was entirely bound to. On October 4, 2022, emergency personnel in Baltimore City received a call for an unresponsive infant. The address they were dispatched to brought them to a residence where they found Naimia Gilliard. She was not responsive. She did not survive. Medical personnel on scene could not revive her, and Naimia Gilliard was pronounced dead. The initial call framed the situation as a medical emergency, an infant who had stopped breathing, the kind of call that paramedics and firefighters respond to with the full urgency of a situation that might still have a survivable outcome. But when medical professionals examined Naimia, what they found was not consistent with a natural or accidental cause of death. The injuries present on her small body told a different story entirely. A story that would ultimately lead investigators, medical examiners, and prosecutors to the same devastating conclusion. The autopsy that followed was conducted by medical examiners from the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for Maryland. Their findings were unambiguous. The cause of Naimia Gilliard's death was ruled a homicide. The medical findings indicated severe internal injuries and evidence of physical harm that could not have been self-inflicted by a 1-year-old child and could not have been the result of an accident. What had happened to Naimia was intentional. Someone had hurt her, and that harm had ended her life. The investigation that followed was careful and methodical. Baltimore City detectives worked to reconstruct the timeline of events leading up to October 4, who had been with Naimia, under what circumstances, and what had occurred in the hours and days before she was found unresponsive. The person who emerged as the primary focus of that investigation was Naimia's own mother, 21-year-old Oriel Montgomery. The investigation took time. Building a case of this nature, particularly in the absence of witnesses other than the perpetrator and the victim, one of whom could no longer speak, required meticulous work. Investigators gathered medical evidence, analyzed the timeline of Naimia's care, consulted with experts, and worked to construct a factual record that could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. On May 11, 2023, approximately 7 months after Naimia's death, the Capital Fugitive Task Force, operating in coordination with Baltimore City law enforcement, located and arrested Oriel Montgomery. She was 21 years old at the time of her daughter's death and 22 at the time of her arrest. She was charged with child abuse and second-degree murder in connection with the death of Naimia Gilliard. The prosecution's case rested on the medical evidence, the autopsy findings that established the nature and cause of Naimia's injuries, and on the investigative record that placed Oriel Montgomery as the person responsible for her daughter's care in the period leading up to her death. The defense did not produce a counter-narrative sufficient to overcome the weight of that evidence. Oriel Montgomery was convicted. The jury found her guilty of child abuse and second-degree murder. She was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a sentence that reflected the severity of what had been done to a 1-year-old child who had no ability to protect herself, no ability to call for help, and no recourse against the person who was supposed to be her protector. Naimia Gilliard never had the chance to grow up. She never had the chance to take her first steps across a room on her own, to say her first full sentences, to experience the thousands of ordinary moments that children accumulate over the course of a childhood. She was 1 year old, and she depended entirely on the adults around her. That dependence was not honored. Her case is a reminder, one of many within this documentary, that the youngest victims of family violence are also the most invisible. They cannot speak to neighbors about what is happening inside their homes. They cannot reach out to teachers or counselors. They exist entirely within the walls of the household that contains them, entirely at the mercy of the adults who control that world. The only advocates they have are the systems built to detect their suffering, and the communities committed to ensuring those systems are funded, staffed, and empowered to act. Oriel Montgomery is serving her sentence. Naimia Gilliard's name is part of the permanent record of Baltimore City's courts, and the obligation to speak her name, to remember that she existed and that she deserved to live, belongs to all of us. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every like and every subscriber helps us continue to tell the stories that matter. Case 4, Jalesia Offer, August 2024, Baltimore City Circuit Court. Case 4, Jalesia Offer, August 2024, Baltimore City Circuit Court. There is a word that appears in criminal cases involving children with a frequency that is both chilling and tragically revealing. That word is discipline. It appears in confessions and in police reports and in testimony, offered as an explanation, sometimes as a justification, for what was done to a child whose body ultimately could not survive the harm inflicted in its name. The word implies structure, intention, a parental right. But when investigators, medical examiners, and prosecutors examine what actually occurred beneath the surface of that word, what they find is something that has nothing to do with guidance or correction. What they find is harm, sustained, severe, and, in too many of these cases, fatal harm. Brian Graham was 6 years old. He lived in Baltimore City with his mother, Jalesia Offer, and her fiancé, Brandon Wheatley. He was at an age when children are learning to read, discovering the world beyond their immediate household, forming the friendships and experiences that build the foundation of who they will become. He was 6 years old, and he was entirely dependent on the adults in his home for his safety, his well-being, and his life. In August of 2024, emergency responders were called to the home where Brian lived. What they found when they arrived was a 6-year-old boy, unresponsive, in a bathtub. Despite their efforts, Brian Graham did not survive. He was pronounced dead, and the scene was handed over to homicide investigators whose job it became to understand exactly what had happened to this child. The medical examiner's findings were the kind that leave no room for ambiguity. Brian Graham had sustained severe injuries that were entirely inconsistent with any accidental cause. His body showed evidence of extensive physical trauma, injuries to internal organs that spoke to the kind of force that investigators described as shocking even by the standards of a profession that regularly encounters violent death. Among the findings were a lacerated liver and fractured ribs, internal and structural injuries that a 6-year-old child's body is extraordinarily fragile against. In addition to the internal trauma, Brian had also sustained severe immersion burns, injuries consistent with exposure to scalding water. 2 people were immediately at the center of the investigation, Jalesia Offer and her fiancé, Brandon Wheatley. Both were taken into custody. As the investigation developed, Jalesia Offer made an admission to investigators that became one of the most significant elements of the prosecution's case. She acknowledged that she had subjected Brian to physical punishment earlier that week, describing what she had done as a form of discipline. The gap between that description and the medical evidence of what Brian Graham's body had endured was enormous. The injuries that investigators documented were not the product of a momentary loss of control or a single impulsive act. They reflected sustained harm serious enough to cause the kind of internal and external injuries that the medical examiner had cataloged. Brandon Wheatley faced trial first. The evidence against him was presented to a Baltimore City jury, and the jury's verdict was unambiguous: guilty. Wheatley was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that reflected the severity of what Brian Graham had endured and the court's judgment about Wheatley's role in that harm. Jalesia Offer's legal journey took a different path. one that illustrated the complexity that sometimes characterizes even the most serious criminal cases as they move through the court system. Initially, Offer reached an agreement with prosecutors, a plea arrangement under which she would plead guilty in exchange for a sentencing recommendation that was more lenient than the maximum her charges carried. This kind of arrangement is not unusual in serious cases. It can serve multiple purposes for both the prosecution and the defendant. However, when the plea came before the court for final approval, the presiding judge rejected it. The judge's decision to decline the proposed sentencing terms was a significant development. In the American legal system, a judge is not bound to accept a plea agreement. They retain the authority to review proposed arrangements and decline them if the court determines the proposed outcome does not adequately serve justice. The consequence of that rejection was immediate and significant. When Offer subsequently withdrew her guilty plea, as she was legally entitled to do once the judge had declined the agreed-upon terms, her original charges were fully reinstated. As of June 2025, Jalesia Offer was facing the full weight of the charges that had been filed against her, and her case was moving forward toward a full trial. Brian Graham was 6 years old. He deserved the full protection of every adult in his life, the full protection of the law, and the full protection of a society that claims to value its children above almost everything else. His case is a reminder that the word discipline cannot be used to shield harm from scrutiny, that the law and the conscience of a community must be willing to examine what actually happens to children behind closed doors and to hold accountable those whose actions ended a child's life. The legal proceedings in the case of Jalesia Offer are ongoing. The court system of Baltimore City is continuing its work. Brian Graham's story is not finished being told. If this case has stayed with you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. It means everything to the mission of this channel. Case 5, Darian Randall, June 9, 2025, Cecil County Circuit Court. Case 5, Darian Randall, June 9, 2025, Cecil County Circuit Court. There are cases in which the act of attempting to conceal what happened becomes, in its own right, a window into the moral magnitude of what was done. The lies that are told in the immediate aftermath of a child's harm, the frantic construction of an alternative narrative, the deliberate misdirection of the people and systems whose job it is to find the truth. These acts of concealment are not only evidence of guilt. They are evidence of a calculated decision to prioritize self-protection over the life and the memory of a child. They are evidence that the person doing the concealing understood, fully and completely, the weight of what had occurred. And that understanding, that awareness, is one of the most damning things a prosecutor can place before a jury. Nola Dinkins was 3 years old. 3 years old, an age of wonder and language explosion, and the kind of fearless curiosity that makes toddlers simultaneously the most exhausting and the most joyful presences in a household. She was at an age when the world is enormous and endlessly interesting and entirely safe, as long as the adults around her are doing what adults are supposed to do. On the daytime hours of June 9, 2025, in Cecil County, Maryland, Nola Dinkins encountered a level of harm that her 3-year-old body could not survive. She was subjected to a severe physical assault by her own mother, Darian Randall, using a leather belt. The assault was prolonged. Nola lost consciousness during the course of it and did not regain it. She was gone. What Darian Randall did next is what transforms this case from a tragedy into something that speaks directly to the question of accountability and the sophistication with which people attempt to escape it. Rather than calling for emergency assistance, rather than doing anything that might have preserved any possibility of Nola's survival or at least ensured that her daughter received the dignity of immediate recognition, Darian Randall chose to hide what had happened. She placed Nola's body inside a suitcase. She wrapped it in plastic. She concealed it inside her residence. And then, on June 10, 2025, the day after Nola lost her life, Darian Randall picked up a phone and placed a call to emergency services. But the call she placed was not a call for help for her daughter. It was a fabrication, a lie constructed with enough detail to be plausible, enough urgency to trigger a major law enforcement response, and enough cruelty to weaponize a system designed to protect children as a tool for her own self-preservation. The story she told was this: her 3-year-old daughter, Nola Dinkins, had been abducted at gunpoint. The alleged abduction, she claimed, had taken place in Delaware. The call triggered an Amber Alert, the emergency broadcast system that exists specifically to protect missing children, that interrupts the ordinary flow of public communication to mobilize an entire society in service of finding a child who is in danger. Law enforcement responded with full resources. An Amber Alert went out. Officers began working the case as an active child abduction. Communities in the region were alerted. People were looking for Nola Dinkins, looking for a living child, a missing child, a child who needed to be found. The fabrication did not hold. Investigators, trained to examine the details of reported crimes with rigor and skepticism, began finding inconsistencies in Darian Randall's account almost immediately. The timeline did not cohere. The specifics she provided did not align. The physical evidence at her residence did not support the story she had told. A search of the home followed. Inside the residence, investigators found the suitcase. Inside the suitcase, wrapped in plastic, was Nola Dinkins. She was gone. She had been there the entire time, hidden in her own home, while an Amber Alert bearing her name was circulating across 2 states. Darian Randall was taken into custody. Under questioning, she confessed. She told investigators what had happened on June 9th, the assault, the leather belt, the moment when Nola went unconscious and did not wake up. She acknowledged what she had done. She acknowledged the fabricated abduction story. She acknowledged the suitcase and the plastic and the hiding of her daughter's body. On June 8th, 2026, approximately 1 year after Nola's death, a Cecil County jury deliberated and returned its verdict. Darian Randall was found guilty of first-degree murder and continuous child abuse. The jury had heard the evidence, had heard the confession, had heard the details of the Amber Alert and the suitcase and the plastic. And the jury had reached the conclusion that the evidence demanded. Nola Dinkins was 3 years old. She died on a June afternoon at the hands of the person who was supposed to love her more than anyone else in the world. She spent hours concealed inside a suitcase while the systems designed to protect children looked for her. She was found, not in time to save her, but in time to ensure that what happened to her would be answered for in a court of law. The conviction of Darian Randall will not undo what was done to Nola. Nothing will. But it affirms something that must be affirmed, something that the law must say loudly and clearly, and without equivocation. Every child's life has value. Every child's harm demands accountability. And the sophistication of an attempt to escape justice does not reduce the moral weight of what was done. It increases it. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These stories need to be told, and your support makes that possible. Case 6. Bernice Bird, October 14th, 2024, Baltimore City Circuit Court. Case 6. Bernice Bird. October 14th, 2024. Baltimore City Circuit Court. There is a particular form of harm that does not announce itself with urgency or dramatic incident, that does not arrive in a single moment of crisis, but accumulates instead over weeks and months in the silent interior of a family home where no one from the outside world is watching. It is harm that operates through absence rather than action, through the withdrawal of food, of care, of the basic human attention that children need not only to grow but simply to survive. It leaves marks, but not the kind that are immediately visible to emergency responders or neighbors or anyone passing by. The marks it leaves are written on the body in a language that only a medical examiner can read, in the measurement of a weight that should have been 3 or 4 times higher, in the evidence of a system that has been failing for a very long time. Zona Bird was 5 years old. She lived in East Baltimore with her parents, Bernice Bird and Gerald Bird. She should have been, at 5 years old, a child on the verge of kindergarten, a child who had grown through the remarkable physical development of early childhood into the beginning of her school years, acquiring language and curiosity and the particular confidence that comes from being cared for and nourished and seen. On October 14th, 2024, emergency services received a call from an East Baltimore address and responded to the residence where the Bird family lived. What they found inside that home is the kind of discovery that stays with first responders for the rest of their careers. Zona Bird was found inside the residence, and she was gone. But it was not only the fact of her death that shook the officers and medics who entered that home. It was the condition in which they found her. Zona weighed 17.5 pounds. She was 5 years old. 17.5 pounds is a weight associated with a young infant, a baby of perhaps 6 to 8 months, still in the earliest stages of physical growth. A healthy 5-year-old child typically weighs between 35 and 45 pounds. Zona Bird weighed 17.5. She was, in the words of investigators who documented the scene, profoundly emaciated. When first responders touched her, she was described as completely cold, not merely reflecting the natural cooling that follows death, but cold in a way that indicated she had been in this condition for some time before anyone called for help. The investigation that followed centered on a question that, in some ways, is even harder to answer than questions about sudden violence. How does a 5-year-old child reach this state inside a home occupied by 2 parents? How does a child reach a weight that is less than half of what she should weigh? And how does that happen without someone noticing, without someone acting, without the dozens of moments of daily interaction, meals, baths, dressing, the ordinary intimacy of parenting, producing an awareness that something was catastrophically wrong? When investigators spoke to Bernice Bird and Gerald Bird about their daughter, the answers they provided were the kind that become exhibits in a criminal trial. Neither parent could accurately recall the last time they had given Zona food. Neither could recall the last time they had meaningfully engaged with their daughter, had checked on her, had held her, had performed the basic acts of parental presence that sustain a child's life. Their daughter had been dying inside their home, and they were unable to account for when they had last treated her as a child who needed care. Both parents were arrested and charged with murder. The case entered the Baltimore City court system, where the legal process worked to examine the full weight of what the evidence showed. Then, in February of 2026, a development occurred that reflected both the severity of the findings and the complexity of prosecuting cases of this kind. Both Bernice Bird and Gerald Bird entered guilty pleas to first-degree child abuse resulting in death. A guilty plea to that charge carries with it a legal acknowledgement, made by the defendants themselves, in open court, before a judge, that their actions, or their failures to act, constituted child abuse of the most severe kind, and that child abuse caused their daughter's death. It is not the same as a murder conviction, but it is an acknowledgement of legal and moral responsibility for what happened to Zona. Zona Bird was 5 years old. She lived in East Baltimore, within a city that contains thousands of families, thousands of children, thousands of households where parents and children navigate the ordinary challenges of daily life. She was surrounded by a city and a society that had resources, child welfare systems, school enrollment processes, pediatric health checkups, community networks that exist, in part, to catch the cases that fall through the cracks of private family life. Her case raises questions that communities must grapple with honestly. What does it take to see a child who is invisible? What systems exist to ensure that the most vulnerable children, the ones whose suffering is quiet, whose harm is accumulative, whose voices are too small to reach anyone outside their own walls, are not simply lost? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. Zona deserved to go to school. She deserved to grow. She deserved to be fed. She deserved to be seen by the people whose entire obligation was to see her. If this case affected you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your engagement helps this channel continue fighting for victims like Zona. Case 7. Jamaria Hall, August 2021, Baltimore City Circuit Court. Case 7. Jamaria Hall, August 2021, Baltimore City Circuit Court. There are moments in criminal investigations when the scene that investigators encounter is so far from anything that belongs in the world of ordinary human experience that the documentation of it becomes almost an act of translation, an attempt to render in the flat, factual language of a police report something that resists reduction to language at all. The discovery made in a southwest Baltimore apartment in the late days of August 2021 was one of those moments. What investigators found inside that apartment, what they found inside rooms where 2 children had lived, where 2 children had gone to sleep, where 2 children had been entirely dependent on the care of the adult who shared that space with them, was the kind of discovery that becomes part of a detective's permanent memory, a scene that cannot be unseen. Denaria Thomas was 8 years old. Her brother Davin Thomas was 6. They were siblings, the older and the younger, the kind of pairing that in a healthy household generates a dynamic of protection and mischief, and the particular affection that builds between children who share a home and a history. They lived in southwest Baltimore with their mother, Jamaria Hall. When investigators entered the apartment in late August of 2021, they found both children. They were not alive. They had not been alive for some time. The state in which they were found, in a condition of decomposition that told investigators days had passed since they had lost their lives, was a testament to a period of time during which no one from the outside world had entered that apartment, during which the children had been there and their mother had not been, during which a silence had settled over that space that no one had broken and no one had questioned. The investigation that followed was intensive. Jamaria Hall had fled the apartment. She was located and taken into custody by Baltimore City law enforcement. When she was interviewed, she did not maintain a story of innocence or ignorance. She confessed. In her confession, she provided investigators with an account of what had happened to her two children, an account that was as direct as it was devastating. She told investigators that she had ended her daughter Denaria's life in the bathtub using water. She told investigators that she had used a sharp object to end her son Davin's life. She acknowledged both acts. She acknowledged that she had then left the apartment, leaving the children there. She acknowledged what was found when investigators arrived. The legal proceedings that followed involved a defense strategy built on the argument that Jamaria Hall was not criminally responsible for her actions at the time they occurred, that her mental state, at the moment she harmed her children, was so severely impaired that the law should not hold her accountable to the same standard applied to a person acting with full awareness and intent. This defense, known in Maryland as the not criminally responsible defense and in other jurisdictions as an insanity defense, is among the most difficult to successfully mount in American courts. It requires not merely a diagnosis of mental illness, but a demonstration that the illness, at the specific moment of the criminal act, prevented the defendant from understanding the nature or wrongfulness of their conduct. The jury considered the defense and rejected it. The finding that Jamaria Hall was criminally responsible for what she had done to Denaria and Davin stood. She subsequently entered guilty pleas to 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each of her children. The court sentenced her to consecutive life terms, meaning that the sentences for each count would be served one after the other rather than simultaneously. Jamaria Hall will spend the rest of her natural life in the custody of the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. Denaria Thomas was 8 years old. Davin Thomas was 6. They were children who had names and faces and the particular inner lives that every child builds in the early years of their existence. Preferences for certain foods, ways they laughed, things they were learning, people they trusted. They deserved to grow up. They deserved to be protected. They deserved to have the full weight of the law speak for them when they could no longer speak for themselves. This case, like every case in this documentary, raises urgent questions about the systems of support that exist for families in mental health crisis, for children living in households where warning signs may be present, and for the communities that surround those households. Mental illness is real, and the intersection of untreated or undertreated mental illness with child welfare is one of the most complex and urgent challenges facing public health and child protection systems in this country. The answer is not to diminish accountability. The answer is to demand both accountability for harm done and vastly better investment in the systems that might prevent it. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. The children in these cases deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us tell their stories. Case 8. Keona Dillon, January 23, 2025, Baltimore County Circuit Court. Case 8. Keona Dillon, January 23, 2025, Baltimore County Circuit Court. There are investigations in which the evidence that investigators gather does not form a narrative that fits any familiar pattern, in which the sequence of events, as it becomes clear over the course of an inquiry, requires the people trying to understand it to set aside their existing frameworks and sit with the full, unmediated strangeness of what they have found. The case of Keona Dillon is that kind of investigation. It is a case in which the harm done to a child was preceded by other acts of harm in the same household, acts that, in retrospect, formed a terrible sequence of events that culminated in the death of an 11-year-old girl in the basement of her family's home in Middle River, Baltimore County. London Olson was 11 years old. 11, an age of beginning transitions, of middle school years approaching. of the particular self-awareness that begins to develop in the late childhood years when children start to form a more complex understanding of themselves and their place in the world. She lived in Middle River, a community in Baltimore County, with her mother, Keona Dillon. On January 23, 2025, emergency personnel were called to the family's home. The call brought responders into the house and eventually to the basement, where they found London Olson on the floor. She was gone. The circumstances surrounding her death and the evidence that investigators began to collect and analyze as the scene was processed were profoundly disturbing in ways that extended beyond the immediate tragedy of an 11-year-old's death. Investigators found that before London lost her life, something else had happened inside that house. The family's four pets had been killed. All four animals, members of the household, living creatures whose presence in a family home is typically one of the ordinary markers of domestic life, had been harmed and were found dead. The killing of the pets preceded what happened to London. For investigators, this sequence, the animals first, then the child, formed a pattern that would inform their understanding of the mental state of the person responsible. The method by which London Olson lost her life, as determined by investigators and medical personnel, involved a plastic drain-cleaning tool that had been used to strangle her. The precision and deliberateness of this act, the selection of an object, the application of it in a specific way, stood in stark contrast to the image of ordinary domestic life that a Middle River home might otherwise project. Keona Dillon was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case moved into the Baltimore County court system. Given the nature of the events and the sequence of behavior that investigators had documented, the court ordered a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation of Keona Dillon, an assessment designed to determine whether she had the mental competency required to meaningfully participate in her own legal defense. On March 3, 2025, approximately 6 weeks after London's death, a Baltimore County judge received the results of that evaluation and made a formal ruling. Keona Dillon was found mentally incompetent to stand trial. The ruling meant that, as of that date, the criminal proceedings against her would be paused while she was placed in the custody of the state's mental health system, where she would receive treatment with the goal of restoring her to a level of competency that would allow the trial to proceed. The case of Keona Dillon sits, as of the time of this documentary, in the same suspended legal space that has characterized so many cases where severe mental illness intersects with the most serious possible criminal charges. The charge of first-degree murder has been filed. The alleged facts of the case have been documented. But the trial has not occurred, because the law requires that a defendant be mentally competent before it can. What is not suspended, and what cannot be, is the fact of London Olson's life and death. She was 11 years old. She lived in Middle River. She had a childhood that was abruptly and violently ended on a January morning in 2025. Whatever the legal process ultimately produces in the case of Keona Dillon, London Olson's name belongs in the permanent record of this community's history. She deserved protection. She deserved a future. She deserved to be safe in her own home. The case continues to move through the mental health and legal systems of Baltimore County. Updates will follow as the proceedings develop. If this story has resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every subscriber is a commitment to keeping these stories alive. Case 9, Moira E. Akers, November 1, 2018, Howard County Circuit Court. Case 9, Moira E. Akers, November 1, 2018, Howard County Circuit Court. There is a category of case within the broader landscape of child harm investigations that presents unique and profound evidentiary challenges. Challenges rooted not merely in the difficulty of gathering physical evidence, but in the deeper medical and scientific questions that sometimes cannot be answered with the certainty that the criminal justice system requires. These are cases in which the facts of what occurred are not in complete dispute, but the interpretation of those facts, what they mean, what they prove, what they establish beyond a reasonable doubt, becomes the central battleground of an entire prosecution. The case of Moira E. Akers is one of those cases. It is a case that has now moved through trial, conviction, appeal, and overturned verdict, and that, as of 2025, is preparing to begin again. Moira Akers lived in Columbia, Maryland, in Howard County, one of the wealthier counties in the state, a planned community built in the 1960s on principles of integration and intentional design, a place not typically associated with the kind of case that would produce a murder conviction. On November 1, 2018, Moira Akers arrived at a hospital. The circumstances that brought her there were the result of a home delivery, a birth that had taken place not in a medical facility with trained personnel and monitoring equipment, but in the privacy of her own residence, in a manner that the people around her, apparently, had not known was coming. When authorities were made aware of the situation and went to Moira Akers' Columbia home to investigate, they found what they found. In a closet, concealed beneath blankets, was a newborn baby boy. He was wrapped in towels. He was inside a plastic bag. He was not alive. The question at the heart of the prosecution that followed, the question that drove the trial, the appeal, and the ultimate overturning of the conviction, was this. Was this baby born alive and then killed? Or had the baby been stillborn, already gone before he ever drew a breath outside the womb? The answer to that question is the difference between a homicide and a tragedy. It is the difference between a deliberate act and a devastating medical event. And in the case of Moira Akers, that answer was not available in the form of unambiguous, universally accepted forensic evidence. The state's position was clear and forceful. Prosecutors argued that Moira Akers' son had been born alive, that he had breathed, that he had been viable, and that his death was the result of deliberate asphyxiation. The method of concealment, the plastic bag, the hidden location, all of these, in the prosecution's framing, were evidence of intent. This was not a mother who had experienced a devastating stillbirth and, in a state of shock and grief, had made terrible decisions about how to respond. This was, according to the prosecution, a mother who had ended her living son's life and then hidden him. The defense maintained the opposite. Moira Akers' legal team argued that the baby had been stillborn, that he had never been alive outside the womb in a meaningful medical sense, that the physical findings relied upon by the prosecution were subject to alternative interpretations, and that the state had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that a live birth had occurred. The jury sided with the prosecution. In 2022, Moira Akers was convicted of second-degree murder and child abuse. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a sentence that reflected the court's acceptance of the prosecution's account of what had happened on November 1, 2018. But the case did not end there. Moira Akers' legal team appealed the conviction, and the appeal found its way to the highest court in the state of Maryland. On February 20, 2025, the Maryland Supreme Court issued its ruling in the case. The court overturned the conviction and ordered a brand new trial. The reasons for an appellate court's decision to overturn a conviction are varied and specific. They may involve questions of evidentiary admissibility, jury instruction, prosecutorial conduct, or constitutional rights. The Maryland Supreme Court's ruling in the Akers case sent the matter back to Howard County for a fresh proceeding, with the full weight of the legal questions at its center remaining unresolved. As of the time of this documentary, Moira Akers is awaiting a new trial. The question that animated the original prosecution, whether her son was born alive and died at her hand, or whether he was stillborn and died before the world had the chance to know him, remains, legally, unanswered. The baby has no name in the public record. He was born, and he was gone, in the space of whatever brief time passed on November 1, 2018, inside a Columbia residence. Whether the law ultimately provides an account of his death that satisfies the standards of proof required by a jury, his existence, however brief, deserves to be acknowledged. He was a person. He was a baby. And what happened to him, whatever its precise legal characterization, is part of the permanent record of Howard County, Maryland. The retrial in the case of Moira Akers will proceed. The outcome of that proceeding, whatever it is, will be the next chapter in a case that has already spanned more than 6 years, 2 verdicts, and the full span of Maryland's appellate system. If this case has stayed with you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Stay with us for the final case. Case 10, Renee Bowman, September 2008, Montgomery County and Calvert County Circuit Courts. Case 10, Renee Bowman, September 2008, Montgomery County and Calvert County Circuit Courts. There are cases that, even within a documentary series that covers the full range of harm that human beings are capable of inflicting on one another, occupy a category of their own. Cases that do not merely represent the failure of one person's conscience or the collapse of one household's capacity for care, but that represent something larger, a sustained, deliberate, years-long campaign of concealment and harm so methodical and so complete that it challenges the imagination of everyone who examines it. Cases in which the discovery of what occurred comes not through any act of investigation or surveillance or system intervention, but through the desperate courage of a 7-year-old child who did the only thing she could think to do. She went through a window. Renee Bowman was a woman living in Lusby, Maryland, in Calvert County, a suburban community removed from the intensity of Baltimore City, the kind of place where the ordinariness of residential life can, in retrospect, provide a very effective cover for what is happening inside a given house. She had 3 adopted daughters. Jasmine was 11 years old. Minette was 9. The third child, whose identity is protected in the public record due to her age and survivor status, was 7. In late September of 2008, the 7-year-old found a window. She went through it. She reached the outside world, the neighbors, the street, the ordinary human presence beyond the walls of that house, and she told people what was happening. What she described was enough to bring law enforcement to the Bowman residence immediately. What the officers who responded to that call found inside the home of Renee Bowman went beyond what the 7-year-old's account had prepared them for. In the basement of the house, there was a freezer. It was padlocked, secured with a lock that was not the kind of measure a person applies to an ordinary household appliance. The officers opened the freezer. Inside, they found the bodies of Jasmine and Minette, Renee Bowman's 2 older adopted daughters. Both children were frozen. Both were dead. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive and disturbing in Maryland history. Medical examiners worked to determine what had happened to Jasmine and Minette. Not merely the immediate cause of their deaths, but the full history of what had been done to them. The findings that emerged painted a picture of sustained, severe abuse over an extended period of time. The girls had been subjected to ongoing physical harm. They had been deprived of adequate food. They had been subjected to physical harm involving objects. They had been asphyxiated. Their breathing had been deliberately stopped. The timeline reconstructed by investigators placed the girls' deaths not in Calvert County, where their remains were found, but back in Rockville, Maryland, in Montgomery County, where the family had previously lived, around late 2007. This meant that Renee Bowman had been carrying the secret of her daughter's deaths for approximately a year, during which time she had relocated from Montgomery County to Calvert County, taking the frozen remains of Jasmine and Minette with her inside a padlocked freezer. And during that entire period, Renee Bowman had continued to receive state adoption subsidy payments for both girls. The state of Maryland, the same state whose child welfare system had placed these children in her care, had been sending her monthly payments for children who were already gone. The financial dimensions of this case revealed a layer of deliberateness that went beyond even the immediate horror of the abuse and the deaths. Renee Bowman had understood, on some calculated level, that the children had monetary value to her, value that continued after their deaths, as long as no one knew they were dead. The 7-year-old who had escaped through the window had endured her own serious harm. She had survived. Her survival was the reason the case ever came to light. Her courage, the courage of a 7-year-old child in an impossible situation, doing the only thing available to her, is one of the most remarkable and heartbreaking elements of a case that contains nothing but remarkable and heartbreaking elements. Renee Bowman was prosecuted in the Maryland court system. The case drew on evidence from both Montgomery County and Calvert County, reflecting the geographic span of the crimes. She was convicted of the murders of Jasmine and Minette, along with charges relating to the abuse of the surviving child. She was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. She will never leave prison. The court's judgment was final and complete. Jasmine was 11 years old. Minette was 9. They were adopted children. Children who had, at some point in their early lives, been placed in the care of the state, and then placed in the care of a woman who was trusted to love them and raise them and give them the childhood that every child deserves. That trust was betrayed in the most extreme way that it can be betrayed. They deserved better. They deserved the life that the adoption system was supposed to provide for them. The surviving child deserved better too. She deserved to have been found sooner. She deserved to have had someone see what was happening inside that house before it reached the point where the only escape route available to her was a window. Her survival is a testament to a resilience that no child should ever be required to demonstrate. This case, the final case in this documentary, leaves us with questions that every community, every state, and every national child welfare system must answer for itself. What does adequate oversight of adoptive families look like? What does early intervention in homes where harm is occurring look like? What does a system that truly sees children, all children, including the ones who are legally invisible as long as a monthly subsidy check keeps clearing, look like? These are not rhetorical questions. They are operational ones. They have answers. And finding those answers, implementing them, funding them, and maintaining them is the obligation that cases like this one place on all of us. Jasmine and Minette and the 7-year-old who escaped through a window in late September of 2008 are part of Maryland's permanent record. Their case changed how investigators and child welfare advocates think about the oversight of adoptive placements and the financial accountability of subsidy systems. Their suffering produced, however belatedly, a response that has made some children safer. It was not enough. It is never enough. But it is something. And the obligation to make it more, to do more, to see more, to act sooner, belongs to every person who watches a documentary like this one and feels the weight of what these children endured. This documentary was produced for Cold Case Hour, a channel committed to responsible, educational true crime content that centers the dignity of victims, the integrity of the legal record, and the ongoing obligation of communities to protect their most vulnerable members. The cases examined in this episode are drawn from publicly documented court records and verified news reporting. All information presented is factual and sourced from the official legal record. This content is intended for educational and documentary purposes. If you or someone you know is in a crisis situation involving child welfare, please contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-4-CHILD. That is 1-800-422-4453. Confidential support is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Please like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support ensures that the stories of victims like Sarah, Jacob, Naimia, Brian, Nola, Zona, Denaria, Davin, London, and the children of Renee Bowman continue to be told, with the seriousness, the care, and the respect they have always deserved.